Hello and welcome to the Total Soccer Show. My name is Daryl Grove. I am not joined by Taylor Rockwell today, but I do have a guest. Today's guest is Jeff Rueter. Jeff is a freelance soccer writer. He writes for ESPN FC, The Guardian, for FourFourTwo magazine. That's FOR, FourFourTwo magazine, Howler magazine, and all kinds of other outlets. Jeff really knows his way around Major League Soccer and Minnesota United, but the league as a whole. So we talk a little playoffs. We talk about the action last night between Atlanta and Columbus, and I'm going to call it the action between Houston and Sporting KC. We give a quick review to that. We also look into the relationship between Major League Soccer and the US men's national team. Is MLS helping or hurting, and what could be done differently? You may also know Jeff from an infamous tweet from about a month ago about MLS expansion. We discussed that tweet in detail, including the story behind it, the fallout from it, and why Jeff still stands by that tweet. We also talk about MLS expansion in general, and in the course of the conversation, this is kind of a long conversation, but it's a really good conversation, come up with some MLS expansion ideas that I think really could benefit American soccer, but I would say that because it was my idea. Before we play the interview, I just want to give a quick thank you to this week's Total Soccer Show sponsors. That was SeatGeek, Roughneck Scarves, Storelli, and also USMNT Centre. SeatGeek, Roughneck Scarves, Storelli, and also USMNT Centre. Thank you for sponsoring the Total Soccer Show this week. Okay, enough from me solo. Here's my conversation with Jeff Rueter. So, Jeff, welcome back to the Total Soccer Show. I think I'm looking at our sort of Skype history here. And last time you were on was January 2017, before Minnesota United set foot into Major League Soccer. Hello.
Hello. Thanks for having me back. Yeah, I think if I remember right, we spent probably 4 or 5 minutes with me talking about why Johan Venegas would be Major League Soccer's breakout player of the year. I know that you and Taylor do your oddly specific predictions. That was the worst oddly specific prediction I think you've had in the history of the show, and neither of you even had it. So you're welcome for carrying that mantle.
We'll send you the award. For worst specific prediction. We're going to talk a bit more Minnesota later on, but I don't mean this as a burn. But first, we're talking playoff teams.
Of course, yeah. Well,
So,
I think I saw some salty Minnesota United fans who were tweeting out that this season Atlanta United and Minnesota United had the same number of postseason wins, and so the two teams were even. Yeah,
that is pretty funny there. So should we get into it? There were 240 minutes of playoff soccer last night. Weirdly, the one that didn't have a goal was the most exciting. So Atlanta hosted Columbus. It went 0-0 for 120 minutes. Then Columbus obviously won on penalty kicks. I think a lot of people called it the best 0-0 draw they've ever seen, at least in Major League Soccer. Would you agree with that?
It's actually really funny. So earlier in the day, a journalism student at the U of M was interviewing me, and he was asking, one of his questions was specifically, let's say that there's a new soccer fan who's tuning in, and it's 0-0 after 90 minutes. How do you tell them that the game was worth watching? And I'm going through, and I'm telling him, it's beautiful to watch the defense, watch their movement, check how the midfield is trying to break each other down, check if they're ever able to have a breakthrough, see if the striker's having a bad day or if he's just not getting distribution, watch for a goalkeeper, giving all of these things to watch for.
Yeah.
And I felt really good about that answer in Atlanta versus Columbus. I felt fantastic about that answer because of the movement. And then suddenly I watched SKC in Houston, and I felt awful about that answer because I think that I probably should have just said, just pop some NyQuil and just call it a day.
So I'm sort of one of those people that is like supportive of Major League Soccer. I want it to succeed. I want people to get into it. And sometimes I turn a game on and I'm like, oh yeah, this is good quality stuff. And sometimes I turn a game on and I'm like, whoa, this looks bad. I hope no one ever watches this. And I think these two games are this sort of exact representation of that, right? Like Atlanta Columbus was really exciting end to end. You had sort of a creative number 10 doing their thing on each team in Higuain and Almiron. Like I get really excited every time Almiron touches the ball, and I'm not an Atlanta fan. I'm just excited to see what he does with it.
Absolutely.
And then Houston Sporting KC, which, if people don't know, Houston won 1-0 in extra time with an Albert Ellis goal. But even that goal, the turnover is Rubio and Espinoza, two Sporting KC players, tackle each other
yes.
at midfield, and then the ball breaks and eventually Elise scores. And it was such a sloppy, I would say borderline violent game.
And the thing about that goal is he actually gets 2 touches to settle the ball within the 6-yard box before he shoots it. So it was his 3rd touch unmarked in the 6-yard box against the best defensive team in Major League Soccer. There was nothing right about that goal. There was nothing right about that game for that matter as well.
Do you have any theory? Do you have any theory on why it was so rough to watch that game?
Well, I mean, if you look at the playing surface, that was awful.
Yes.
I don't know if you could. I mean, so Unimas's cameras, when it was at the main view, you could kind of just see like little divots, but it looked like maybe your TV that you just invested in suddenly crapped out on you.
Right.
But then they would go to, the coach's cam, so they would go to a throw-in or a substitution, whatever, and you could look, and it was just, it honestly, it looked like there was a sophomore in high school class that had just had their first ever golf trip, and just divots all over the field. It was appalling, honestly. And so I think that kind of slows down the play. Kansas City, obviously, pragmatic, I suppose, would be the nicest term for it as far as their offense. They had one player who had shown throughout the last few years that he could score goals, and then they sold him and didn't really replace him. So I think that their game plan, especially on the road, and it was a stat that I was able to pull up for my playoff preview last week for ESPN FC, but they'd only won 2 games out of 19 tries when they were on the road in postseason play between the Kansas City Wiz days and Sporting Kansas City. And so now that's 2-20 or 2-21. For whatever reason, once they leave the friendly confines, they really do struggle. And this Houston team, I think it's actually more surprising that Houston struggled to break down Kansas City given the attacking output that they'd had for most of the season.
Yeah, I think if Houston is a kind of a counter-attacking team, and Kyoto can, if he gets loose on the counter, you're in trouble. But that didn't seem to happen last night. No,
not one bit. And Cubo Torres was pretty much entirely neutralized. Iko Para showed exactly why he had been. He was my vote at least for Defensive Player of the Year. My runner-up was Michael Parkhurst, and both had pretty good games. But Apara was just absolute masterclass from him. I think that one of the announcers had said that. Maybe this was a Kansas City radio guy. I just saw this pass through Twitter that this was not a game that 2017 Iko Para deserved to be a part of. Just as far as the result goes. I thought he truly did well, and I was honestly rooting for him. He had one break in about 119th minute, I want to say, where he had a shot on goal, and I just wanted it to go in so desperately because a bit like Aurelian Collin in 2013, it was just the one bald central defender carrying Kansas City to glory, and didn't quite play out that way. But
so he doesn't deserve to be out of the playoffs either.
No, he doesn't. I'm honestly looking forward to seeing NYCFC pick him up. It sucks, because
is that a rumor or is that definitely happening?
No, that can't happen. The rules without, but if the Galaxy were still in the playoffs, we could actually make that joke and people would buy it. That's the unfortunate part. So, sadly, no Iko Para. He's going to be. You have to think that he's going to get called in for the Portugal game, though, right? For the U.S. national team.
He's one of those weird players where because it's never really happened for him, you just assume there's some weird reason and it's never going to happen.
Well, I feel like the weird reason has been his knees, right? Or it's been...
I didn't know that.
Some freak injury. Last 2016, he started off and he was, again, Defensive Player of the Year type. I think he was going to be a front runner probably for the All-Star game, and then suddenly he did his one of his legs. And I'm trying to remember what the injury was, but every single season so far it's been an injury, except for this year. And so hopefully, he's still... I feel like he's 26. There's
so there's still a possibility.
There's no better way to prove that you cover Major League Soccer than basing a player's age off of a feels like, as if it's like a temperature. But he feels like he's 26 years old. So and center backs obviously can have a bit longer career. Or they can stay relevant until 30, 32. So we'll see. Maybe he'll get called in and bench for Omar Gonzalez or something. I'm not sure, but it'll be interesting to see. He is one of those players I thought should have been on the Gold Cup roster, and I certainly hope he gets his shot in this next cycle.
Well, we'll see what Dave Sarakin thinks in November, or whoever is selecting that roster. So the other guy you mentioned, not for the US national team anymore, but Michael Parkhurst, came off the bench, had that off-the-line clearance to keep Atlanta alive at least a little bit longer. I really want to just take a good look at that game because I feel like there was a lot of drama because Atlanta sort of has that big crowd, right? Was it nearly 70,000 were there last night?
Right.
So it was really exciting just to see that in MLS, right? To see that big crowd willing that team on. But then there's
a quick interjection about that crowd too? So obviously covering Minnesota United, there was very little focus of mine on Atlanta United, just because, frankly, I don't think many of the people who read the team-specific coverage I do really wanted to hear about Atlanta United this year.
Yeah.
So
just as it's like a what could have been kind of thing.
Kind of, yeah. I don't know. I mean, I think that honestly that comparison of Atlanta to Minnesota, just like Orlando to New York, it really is like an apples to cats analogy. It's not even apples to oranges. It's it's very different projects, but for whatever reason, there's a strange sort of inferiority.
It's just like if two people walk in the door at the same time, then you kind of judge them against each other, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's him or him, or whatever. But that Atlanta crowd, I mean, it was, I think, the most impressive part for a city that's never been able to foster a first division soccer club, or never seemed like a viable city for expansion up until, the last 5 years probably.
Yeah.
With interest. It was incredible not just to draw 70,000, but they were 70,000 informed, engaged fans. And I think that's something that really kind of slips with these numbers. The numbers are impressive, just like FC Cincinnati's are in the USL. But for both teams, the fans know when something is like if they caught Pedro Santos on a counterattack and suddenly you see Julian Gressel backtrack and dispossess him, the crowd went wild, which is what should have happened. It's not like they're just waiting for shots and waiting for goals and for amazing saves. So I do just quickly want to say, very impressed, not just with the quantity, but the quality of the fans in Atlanta United. And I think that it's been, it's kind of frightening, actually, to think that this is just the building block foundational year and to see where it goes from here. So hats off to all of them. But yeah, there was a game that was played as well.
Yeah, well, the opponent, I was going to say, had their own drama. Obviously, Columbus has this Austin thing sort of hanging over the team. Right. And so I thought that really gave it an element of drama, because obviously if you go to the semi-final, you get home and away games, right? So they're going to host a playoff game in the next round.
Yeah, and I think they actually host the first leg of it, if I'm not mistaken.
Wow.
That might be the 30th already, but it's
going to come fast, right? These next two games, they come really fast.
They come really fast, yeah.
It's Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, right?
That Columbus hosted game against NYCFC, that is going to be an absolute must-watch. If you're looking for an angle that has nothing to do with the crew in Austin, which I could talk about for a while as well, and I'm sure you could and have before too, but it's because David Villa has scored more goals against Columbus since entering the league in 2015 than any player has scored against any specific team.
Wow.
And so it's not just a battle of, the Heart versus New York City. It's a battle of David Villa trying to take down Columbus as he has every other time.
Well, it's going to be David Villa versus Zach Steffen, so he may have his work cut out for him based on, especially if you watch the highlights of last night's game.
So when David Villa was having his big breakouts over in La Liga, how old was Zach Steffen?
Ooh, he's at least 10 years younger, right? So
right.
Yeah.
Well, Steffen's 22.
Yep.
I feel like Villa's 33. We're going with the feels like age.
Yeah, but I think you're about right. Villa maybe 34, 35, but yeah, so he's just over 10 years, a little more than 10 years. Yeah,
it's crazy. Yeah, like Zach Steffen was probably 10 watching that 2006 World Cup and just saying, like, someday I'm going to face off against him in MLS Cup playoffs.
I'm going to keep a clean sheet.
I love it.
So I saw a quick interview with Steffen after the game when he really said that the big crowd in Atlanta, weirdly, they set up as a motivating factor for Columbus. They wanted to silence them. And that's one of those things that, sometimes players just say things and you don't really take it seriously. But when Adam Jean, I think is how you pronounce it, when he scored the winning penalty kick, he did a big shushing noise, right, over to the crowd. So seeing that made me think, maybe that really was some weird motivation that Columbus sort of had to try and silence that crowd, which I found like a really interesting thing, because you don't hear that in Major League Soccer very often.
No, Will Trapp had told one of the local reporters, I think it was Andrew Erickson, during the week that the league does not want Columbus to win in Atlanta. The league wants Atlanta to host more home games, so we're going to beat them.
Of course they would, yeah.
Yeah, and it was incredible.
And the league won't want a big Save the Crew televised moment, right?
No. I think that they probably weren't happy. The ESPN2 cams, anytime there was a corner in the second half, and they were for some reason, every single time Brad Guzan was in his box before a spot kick of any kind or before a free kick of any kind, they cut to him pointing and saying, right, stop, there. Just never with Stefan, but always with Brad Guzan. I don't know if maybe they just like his bald head, but right behind him in the second half, there was a giant Sunil out banner that made it on the ESPN2 feeds over and over, and I absolutely loved it. I thought it was very tasteful to have one of the goalkeepers from this last cycle right in front of a Sunil out banner.
Strategically placed. More strategically placed than the US players were against Trinidad. So I do think sort of this whole Atlanta thing, it definitely brings a new element to the league, and I kind of just wish there was more of it, I guess.
Yeah, I do too. Well, I mean, the good news is if seeding follows through on the Western Conference, you're going to get a home-and-home fixture between Portland and Seattle.
Okay.
And that is absolutely delicious. So you've got Seattle and Vancouver in the interim. That's not bad either. Mm-hmm. And then Portland and Houston, I guess you can be excited about it. It's just, I know that it's been one of the narratives going into this postseason, but it was kind of shocking to see the difference between the East and the West once you get past the top two teams in each conference.
Yeah.
I mean, that Red Bulls team in a lot of years, just if you look at how they played against Chicago, but also how they finished the season probably from July on, I would say, that was, probably one of the top 5 teams in the league, and they got the 6th seed. Meanwhile, you're watching the 4-5 game last night between Kansas City and Houston, and there was a beautiful there are very few moments that get American soccer Twitter to unite and rally around one topic. The just overall disdain for last night's game of Houston-Kansas City was absolutely breathtaking.
Yeah, I saw a lot of, can both teams get eliminated?
Yeah, I tweeted that one out too.
Oh, that was you? Okay.
That was me, yeah. And so it's just, it was unreal. And every other year, it's been the West, and then the East, you'll get that DC versus New England game. Mm-hmm. And that's the one where it's just kind of plodding and whatever. It's very methodical. It's playing checkers instead of chess, something. And instead, I don't know if it's like there was a Space Jam moment this last offseason where Atlanta United and the Eastern Conference as a whole took all of the energy from the LA Galaxy in the West. But for whatever reason, they were the Monstars this year, and they rallied.
I love a Monstars reference on the Total Soccer Show.
There you go. This is why I'm here.
One of the other reasons you're here is I wanted to talk to you about a recent story you wrote for The Guardian about the relationship between Major League Soccer and the US men's national team. I believe the headline is, was MLS really to blame for the USA's World Cup failure? So, first question for you is, did you write that headline, or was there a sub-editor who wrote that headline?
I went back and forth with my editor for a couple of drafts on that, and then he proposed it.
Okay.
And I looked it over, and I didn't think... if I'm given an option to actually choose a headline, I am going to give some pushback, and I thought that pretty much perfectly encapsulated it. Yeah.
Okay, so without summarising the whole article, the final line I think is the really interesting one. If the US national team is to get back on the right track, its relationship with Major League Soccer may need to change. And that's the thing I find really interesting because obviously you're a Major League Soccer expert, more so than sort of Taylor and I. But we've gone back and forth on the show, I think, a fair bit over the last couple of weeks, about ways that maybe MLS could alter its relationship with the US national team to benefit the US national team. So I wanted to get into it with you about sort of what are the pros of the relationship, what are the cons of the current relationship, and what could change in the future for the better. Should we start with the positive? Like, how does MLS help the US national team to begin with?
100%, because I think is it only 2 weeks since that Trinidad and Tobago game?
The recent unpleasantness occurred on October the 10th.
Goodness, yeah, that feels like forever ago now, doesn't it? This endless kind of just mist that we've been walking through.
And just 3 or 4 days before that, we were beating Panama 4-1, and I was dancing around our office and celebrating, and that was a whole different, And Panamanian journalists were yelling at Hernandario Gomez about how he's terrible.
Right. That's right. Yeah, and one of my friends had told me that he had celebratorily ordered a pizza before the Trinidad game kicked off, and he had said the last time he had done that was someday in November in 2016. So, just blame my friend. Blame my friend. If you disagree with that, I'll blame my friend.
Yeah, he should stop eating pizzas.
Order some pizza. Yeah, order pizza if you're happy with Trinidad and Tobago and the current state of affairs. Not the point. So the positives, because we're not getting a lot of those. The positives would be getting minutes for young players. I think there are 2 examples actually over the last 2 games where it's very obvious how Major League Soccer is helping the U.S. men's national team program. If you look at that Red Bulls game, Tyler Adams, throughout the season, you've been watching him progress and become, a true... it's almost like he's becoming a second version of Kellen Acosta, but with maybe a little more creativity.
Yeah.
You know,
Like Kellen was the first draft and Tyler Adams is the perfected draft.
Second draft. Exactly. I would say so. I mean, they both played fullback, arguably out of position early in their careers when they were 18, 19, 20. I would assume that Adams will end up anchoring in the central midfield. Probably him and Weston McKennie, Emerson Hyndman, Gideon Zalalem, or Acosta.
Yeah. Jonathan Gonzalez, I could see in
Jonathan. Oh, I'm a big Jonathan Gonzalez fan. Yeah. I'm offended that I left him out myself. So thank you.
We won't tell him. We won't tell him.
Oh, good, please. But yeah, those are 5. I mean, pretty quality names, to be fair, for the central midfield, possibly. Mm-hmm. But if you look at Adams, and I would say Christian Roldan's another example of this as well.
Yes.
You're able to get these guys who are 2021, not quite to the Weston McKennie level where he'll get poached very young and will be able to play early, or the Gideon Zalalem level, where they just immediately are going abroad. And so in Adams' case, he's able to stay close to home and do his schooling. I talked to him ahead of the homegrown game, and he was talking about how much it did help to be able to, still be around his family, still be around his friends, focus on it, learn the Jesse Marsh system. I guess he started in the Petke days, but and then eventually be ready just to plug right in. And he talked to some end about how important that was for him to be able to feel comfortable. And that, yes, he does indeed have aspirations to go play elsewhere, but only after he feels like he's gotten everything he can out of the league. More on that in a second.
So I'm with you on that. And obviously, I'm not sure how regular you listen to TSS, but I feel like we talk about Tyler Adams every show, whether it's like in the notes to talk about or not. We sometimes just end up there because I'm super excited about the way he plays and his whole story, right? Development Academy, MLS, and future in Europe, we assume. But I'd argue that there's not enough Tyler Adams in Major League Soccer. Like, I wish every team had like 1 or 2 versions of that story.
Yeah, I do too. The second story, we'll get to that in a second, actually, because I think that's much more of a con. The second version of why MLS has been helping is Zach Steffen, right?
Yeah.
You look at him, he goes off to Freiburg. Yep, Freiburg. He gets lost in the system. He's playing for the second team occasionally, not even starting every week. 20 years old, comes back to Columbus. He doesn't play the rest of the year because Steve Clark is already installed, but they let go of Clark and they just hand him the keys, which is a pretty gutsy move if you think about it. A 21-year-old who hasn't played regularly since he was at Maryland.
Yeah.
But he was able to come back to the region, at least, that he grew up in to an extent. I don't know if Maryland and Ohio would at all consider themselves in the same region. But he's able to come back, and he's able to play regularly at 22 at goalkeeper, which, unless you're Gianluigi Donnarumma type talent, doesn't happen very often. He's able to get reps. Now he's able to get postseason reps. He's had a huge game in a stadium of 70,000. And I know it's not Old Trafford, but at that same point, say he does go back to a mid-table Bundesliga team in a year or two. He has experience shutting down a crowd of 70,000 who all wanted him to fail. That's invaluable experience. He's getting minutes, played probably 31, 32 games this year. That's invaluable as a young keeper too. So it's giving young players who are U.S. players a chance to hone their craft and be ready for the next step of their careers.
So it's kind of like a Landon Donovan thing, right? That if you're a talented teenager, you can go to Europe, give it a shot. If it doesn't work out for whatever reason, whether it's you're not given an opportunity or maybe you are just homesick and that doesn't work out, you have a place and a league to come back to. But I'd argue that's the case. If MLS was structured completely differently, that would always be the case, right? As long as you have a league in your country, you can always come back to it.
Like Brooks Lennon.
Yes.
Who wasn't able to get the minutes at Liverpool, didn't really want to go to probably was fine going to the championship, but going to RSL, I mean, again, it's like Tyler Adams. You're much more comfortable in your home area.
Yeah,
and now who knows what his future holds, whether he could be like a Brighton and Hove Albion type of guy, something. But he hasn't been too bad either this year.
No, he scored on the final day of the regular season, right? It's a shame he didn't get a shot in the playoffs, because I feel like you do also in the playoffs, you kind of, I think because there are fewer games, obviously, and there's more national attention on each game, you kind of have an opportunity to catch everybody's attention, which I'd argue is what Zach Steffen did against Atlanta. So, if Brooks Lennon had been in the playoffs, there could have been like one of the type of goals he'd scored for RSL this year, that some of them have been really impressive. Like if that's with everybody watching, suddenly more people are talking about Brooks Lennon.
Right, and it's easy scouting. It's like, why?
Yeah.
I mean, it's a tournament, right? And there are a lot of teams that'll make moves off of tournaments, and there are very few of those moves that work out.
Yeah.
But they'll watch like a DeAndre Yedlin in the World Cup and say, yeah, he's a $X million fullback. Let's bring him to Tottenham, and then he'll get lost in the quagmire, and then he'll have to go off and prove himself elsewhere. But that's how that move finalizes, is because of a strong tournament. MLS Cup gives that opportunity, I suppose, for these young players. Tyler Adams, I'm sure, is going to be very sought after this winter. Kyle Larin, there are very few things Kyle Larin could use more than an Orlando City playoff run. And that and maybe some good distribution behind him. But it's, I think it does help. And I think that it does raise the stakes. You're able to get more of a big game mentality because you don't want your season to end. And so as long as you're able to get that experience, which the U.S. Open Cup, unfortunately, has never fully been able to simulate for these players, I think that, yeah, that is a benefit for both the league and for the playoff system that's very widely derided by people who, I suppose, cover the game outside of the United States.
So what are the cons then of MLS and the US men's national team?
Well, I think that the biggest one here, Daryl, has been, if you're looking at this lost generation, Brian Scotteretta put out a fantastic piece for ASN about the lost years, about this 8-year window that maybe one key player over each of these 8 years was growing after there were about 2 or 3 per year. And it's, how do you make up for that, right? So let's say you don't get to the Olympics, and I know the Olympics isn't the World Cup. It's not even the Copa America Centenario or whatever. It's not this massive tournament, but it is playing against your age group across the world, and you are, playing a game against Spain, and that doesn't happen very often if you're in that ranks. So how do you make up for that experience? Well, you might have to go abroad, right? I think if you look at a player like Giassi Zardes, who broke out in a big way in 2015, became Jurgen Klinsmann's winger/striker of choice before Jordan Morris. He was the most, I think, if I remember right, he was the most capped player that year. And it was like the most capped for a player making his first cap that same year.
Right.
It was unreal how much he was growing, developing. He was working with Robbie Keane. He was still working. I think this was the first year after Donovan, possibly. But, he had all of these key pieces around him who were making him better, teaching him, helping him hone his craft. And then he stagnated. And I think for a player like Giassi, maybe he did get everything out of Major League Soccer from a developmental side. Or a Darlington Nagbe who had couldn't agree to a contract with Celtic this last winter. Yeah. And this was the example. It was actually really funny. I try not to read the comments on my articles, but one of my favorite comments from that Guardian piece was, if you don't want to read the article, just know that Rueter thinks that if Darlington Nagbe went to Celtic, the U.S. would have qualified for the World Cup. And because that was the one example that I'd kind of used to frame this whole argument. But I think you look at it and, yeah, it's not perfect. Remember when Stoke City went on that run of signing 4 U.S. international players over the course of 3 seasons between Agudelo, Breck Shea, Maurice Edu, and Jeff Cameron? Only one of those 4 stuck, and Mo came close, but he had his best days, obviously, with Rangers, and then came back to Philadelphia. And if you look at Shea, Agudelo, and Mo Edu, they all came back, and they got bigger paydays for coming back. And Alejandro Bedoya, for the same reason. Each is obviously a very different case, but I do think that it might have been a benefit for Juan Agudelo to have gone, tested himself. He didn't get the work visa, and so he was at Utrecht, and it didn't quite work out there. But at least, he gave it a shot, and now he's still kind of one of those fringe pool forwards for this next cycle.
I kind of thought Agudelo, I'm not sure exactly. I know he couldn't get a work permit in England because there's a sort of a tougher standard to meet because the government sets who gets a work permit, right? But I know that in the Netherlands it was easier, and I believe he was still wanted there and could have stayed there, was my understanding. But he instead sort of said, all right, like Premier League or Championship or nothing, because I'm going back to MLS. I'm not sticking in the Netherlands. Yeah,
and it's a bananas train of thought, isn't it?
Yes.
It's a.
And to be fair, I haven't specifically seen a quote that says that, but those are the pieces I put together from the story.
And for the fact that doesn't surprise me in the slightest either. That says something too. But you look and you see a lot of these U.S. players who have been playing in Germany now over the last couple of years, and these young players who are going to places like Schalke, places like Wolfsburg, almost going to Werder Bremen in Jordan Morris's case. For whatever reason, it's become a very intriguing option, and I think it is a good alternative for the kind of Anglophile Premier League or bust, and maybe part of that actually is because FS1 is boosting their Bundesliga coverage, and so now the average soccer-loving teenager is actually familiar with the German league.
Oh, so it's more about perception of those leagues among younger players. Like you want them to see Germany and maybe the Netherlands as sort of almost equal to the Premier League in terms of their ambition.
Yeah, or if not equal, then at least viable. Because like you think La Liga and Serie A, I think they're both carried by beIN, is it? Yeah. And that's not as widely viewed as ESPN, NBC, and FS1. And so maybe, and with the championship being on ESPN more, I bet this is actually me coming up with a theory on the fly, so it's probably very wrong.
These are always great moments,
aren't they? But I think that if you're growing up and you're just like, I'm waking up on a Saturday, I've grown up past the age of watching cartoons on Saturday mornings, I guess I'll watch some football, then maybe it does help to be able to say, oh, Pulisic's on. Okay, well, he's 4 years older than me. I'll give it a shot. Let me see what that Bundesliga is like. Oh, Hanover is not falling over entirely. Okay, maybe that's a viable league. And so you watch more and more and more of that, even when Pulisic isn't playing.
Get me Steve Cherundolo's number.
Yes. Maybe that's the case, though. I don't know. Or maybe you see Weston McKennie and you say, wow, I haven't heard nearly as much about him as Pulisic. Let me watch more of him because he's starting almost every game now, which is phenomenal. Or Haji Wright, if I don't think the second Bundesliga is ever carried. But, it's more accessible than trying to watch Italy or Spain or the Netherlands. Those are maybe buried. And so I think maybe that's part of where the perception that the Premier League is the be-all, end-all for an American player comes from, is because that's the one that's most familiar outside of Major League Soccer. So I've taken us off track. Ties into the cons. Yeah. But I think if you're looking like this group of players, now we've got Bill Hamid leaving, and he's going to be going.
Arguably a couple of years too late, right?
Easily a couple of years too late. And I think that you could say the same about Sean Johnson, honestly. I'm starting to get the Alexi Lawless juices flowing. I'm just going to name drop all these players who should have left a couple years ago. But if you look at that goalkeeping class, because now for the first time since early 90s, late 80s, there's a serious question mark. And you've talked about this, about who's the goalkeeper of the future. Yeah. And Horvath has kind of seen as the de facto guy. Is that because he is already abroad plying his trade? And so you've got Bill Hamid leaving now. Sean Johnson he toiled away in Chicago. I think that it has actually been a step up for him to be in NYCFC. But Chicago probably got to him, after a while. There's only so much you can get. Zach Steffen, I interviewed him for a piece that's been stuck in the coffers at ESPN for longer than it should have been, where I kind of compared and contrasted the the journeys of him and Joe Zhao, and talked to both of them, if you remember him.
I do.
Yeah, and he's talked about how he does absolutely have ambitions to go back to Europe, and so maybe that's the case for this generation that didn't get the Olympic time, wasn't called in partly because of that to this World Cup cycle. How do you make up for that? Maybe that's one way you do it. Maybe you are in the championship or you're in the second Bundesliga, but at least that way you're trying something different.
So my question then is, how is this sort of for want of a better phrase, how is this MLS's fault? Like, for example, if Jesse Zardes had gotten all he could get out of Major League Soccer in his first couple seasons and probably arguably should have gone to Europe if he was going to step it up to the next level, is that Jesse Zardes' fault? Or is it Major League Soccer's fault, or is it LA Galaxy's fault? So
it's a combination of the three, right?
Yeah.
The easy one for the player is if you wanted to force the move to happen, you stop showing up to training, everyone thinks you're a dick, and then suddenly you're
right.
gone.
I guess players never do that in MLS, do they?
No, never. I thought that Kyle Larin was going to earlier this year, and then for one reason or another, he came back tail between his legs. But that's part of it. I think, honestly, one of the biggest things is the transfer process for a player to leave Major League Soccer. Right.
This goes to the Darlington Nagbe situation as well, right? Because you mentioned contract earlier, that you didn't agree a contract with Celtic, but I thought it was transfer fee was never
It was
agreed.
Both, yeah.
Oh, okay.
It was both. Because at first, Celtic had offered, I think, a reported $3 million. No, it was a $2 million transfer fee. But because of Nagbe's service years, only about half of that would have gone to the Portland Timbers. And so they're looking at it, and Portland's like, why am I selling our best central midfielder for $1 million? That's ludicrous. Or like for Matt Miazga, it took a while because the Red Bull...
only Dr. Evil would think that was a good deal.
$1 million. Right, exactly.
And everyone would tell him, no, it's not worth what you think it is.
No. And then he'll be like, no, but there's so many zeros. Let's take it. And so, all right, Mary Paulson's Dr. Evil. I look forward to my mentions on Twitter, Portland fans. But then you go from there, and it's okay. So then they doubled it, right? And so then finally Portland's like, okay, $2 million, $1.5 million, something. Great, we're happy with this. Let's take the cut. It's up to you now to negotiate it. And then NAGB can come to terms because Major League Soccer recently, as I'm sure you've noticed, has probably been overpaying for top-level domestic talent.
Yeah.
Right. Like I mentioned very briefly that Alejandro Bedoya, he's on $20K a week as far as typical European league terms, earning $1 million a year. And
for Philly, that's what he's getting for Philly?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
But it's tough for me to imagine that there aren't mid-level tables in the Big Five leagues, or mid-level teams, in these Big Five leagues who are looking at a player like that saying, yeah, that's worth $20K a week.
Right. So you're saying Bedoya came home too soon and not for much more money than he probably could have got anyway.
Right. Yeah. But the league is able to make that offer, and I don't know what he was on at I don't know what that number was, so I might be totally off base. Maybe he was only earning like $7K a week, and this is a massive upgrade. And if that's the case, you can't blame him. You can't blame Michael Bradley for coming back for what he came back for.
Yeah, that was always my argument. Is you've got to look at it from the player's perspective, and they want to make the most of their careers and they want to be comfortable. And my argument is always that maybe Major League Soccer should stop making those offers, as opposed to the players should stop accepting them.
And that's part of it too, right? You make
it's
that
like putting temptation in front of people.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And you can't blame a person then when they fall into that temptation.
Yeah.
And so then when you're having Jurgen Klinsmann, who was saying Clint Dempsey came back too soon, Michael Bradley came back too soon, the only moves that he actually looked at and said that might have been good for the player are moves like Jermaine Jones, Tim Howard. But Tim Howard, it was a very kind of like half-hearted, maybe he could have gone to a relegation zone team and stuck it out, kind of what Guzan ended up doing with Middlesbrough.
Yeah.
But especially Jermaine Jones, he was like, yeah, I get it. We need to keep him at the best competition possible. Bundesliga clubs weren't going to be coming after him even after that World Cup because of his age. Let's get him into New England. And then it all went south from there. But that was one of the rare moves, and that partly is, and actually mostly is, because of age. And if you look at Bradley, Dempsey, they were still at the height of their powers. Josie Altidore was just entering his, you could argue. Yeah.
So here's my question then. What could we change to make this relationship better, to stop players coming back before their prime, to have them not come back to MLS until they're sort of they've sort of exhausted their options, or they've achieved all they can achieve in Europe, and the best level of competition they can go at is Major League Soccer. The problem is that Major League Soccer wants that star power in the league.
It needs it.
And is there any way to sort of to square that circle and make it so that MLS isn't tempted, MLS teams aren't tempted to make big money offers to US players who are overseas?
That's the multi-million-dollar question here, and it's one that now is a something $100 million question if you're looking towards the revenue for the future cycle. Case by case, obviously, it's very different. Every player needs different things. I think Dempsey was actually pretty close to the right time. That was the move that really kind of turned the corner for Major League Soccer as a league once Dempsey came to Seattle.
That was the first big domino, right?
Yeah, it was. And then Bradley was maybe the bigger domino just in terms of like where he was at in his career with Roma. But Dempsey was the reason that we're even having this discussion now. And yeah, maybe he could have gotten a little more or another year at Spurs, but Spurs wasn't the Harry Kane Dele Spurs. They weren't this Pochettino level. They were this mid-table team at that point. So it's not as if he punted on Champions League by any stretch. That seems totally fine to me. And for a player like Dempsey, too, best attacker in the U.S. pool alongside Donovan. Donovan's already in the league. Now you get Dempsey versus Donovan in the league. That's great for the league. It's great for the player. The player suddenly is one of the best strikers in the league. That's good for the player's ego as well. That move actually did make a lot of sense to me. So how do you make this better? It's player to player, right? I think that it does need to ultimately come down to Major League Soccer is going to continue to make these offers, right?
So we can't stop them, basically.
No, we can't, and we shouldn't, because I do think the league does need to grow, and that is one way to grow, is you look and say, hey, young American future player, boy or girl, look, you've got, Clint Dempsey is going to be coming to your market. Go watch him, see what he does in person, and then grow the game from there. That's great for the game.
Do you have a fix, or are we just going to have to accept it? Is the fix just cross your fingers and hope it doesn't get too bad?
In a sense, yeah, I think that part of that is, I mean, continue to better the youth development, continue to make it easier for these young players, these Zardezes, these Kyle Larins, I know he's Canadian, but, you know, these young, high-quality players to be able to set sail and go elsewhere, because right now that transfer mechanism is making it really tough for a team to try to sell. He's not quite to this level, but Christian Ramirez is kind of like Agudelo, one of those kind of fringe forwards. He hasn't gotten his cap yet. He's 26, but over the last 3 windows now, Minnesota United has fielded 7-digit offers for Christian Ramirez from teams in Liga MX.
Right.
And at first they said no. He actually got an offer. I don't know if I've even talked about this, but in 2016 he got an offer from Sporting Kansas City as well. But that was a much smaller transfer. And so at that time, the team was in NASL. They were about to move to MLS. It made no sense to sell your star player. But now, let's say that it was, I don't know, let's say it was an $1 million offer from one of these Liga MX teams. Why is Minnesota United going to accept $350,000 for their best attacker? You know, it just doesn't make any sense. So there needs to be some sort of change so that there's more, it's more acceptable for a team's on-field performance to actually be able to let go because you get the money to reinvest in your academy or other players.
Do you see a mechanism that could be changed without sort of shaking up the whole MLS system too much? Like, is it just that the teams could keep more of the transfer fee in some way that might make it easier to persuade teams to do it?
Yeah, I think so. I think that if you're able to tell Portland off the bat that of this $2 million transfer fee, you get more than half of it, I think that they're much more willing to make that deal.
Yeah.
You know, and then maybe Celtic isn't off already going into player negotiations, and maybe they're going to say, okay, we've got an extra $5,000 a week that we can offer you, NAGB, to make this work. You know, and so I do think that's an easy fix to me. And I know that that's tough for the league, but if you get a better TV contract at the next negotiation, you can afford to lose a little more of that transfer fee each time it comes in.
I had it suggested to me on Twitter, and I'm really sorry because I can't remember who suggested this idea to me, but it was that the league, the policy should be that because the league essentially pays the salaries of the players, right? That maybe the transfer fee should be, it all goes to the team, but you'd subtract you subtract total salary that's been paid over the course of the player's contract with the club.
Sure. Yeah.
That could be an easy formula to put together.
Yeah, absolutely. But I think that, as well as, you know, cutting the percentage, it does let the team get more comfortable with losing a player like Nagbe, who's become synonymous with the Timbers at this point of his career.
Yeah.
And make it easier for him to part ways, go to still wear green, and ultimately better his chances at being a regular starter for the U.S. national team, if that's the goal of Major League Soccer, which it started out as. And now it's a question of, is that still the goal, to help develop the game at the highest level, or is it to make the league itself better? I think that that's a question that the league needs to answer to.
I mean, I still want it to be to get as many kids like Tyler Adams into first teams as quickly and as regularly as possible. Because I would love a situation where, and this isn't the case right now, but I would love a situation where Timbers are thinking, do we sell Darlington Nagbe? Well, probably yes, because we've got this kid coming through and he can do a similar thing. You know what I mean? I wish there was always a replacement coming through that teams were willing to sort of gamble on. And that's why, I know they're not the same player at all, but that's why these sort of Dax McCarty moving on from New York and then Tyler Adams coming in, that seemed like even though it seemed weird at the time, it seems like the sort of thing I would like to see teams doing. It just means we need more Tyler Adamses, which is kind of easier said than done, right?
Yeah, that's such an easy ask, right? But no, I do think that you're absolutely right. You know, that made that Chicago-New York game that much juicier because you were watching a player, and this is why they made the move. You finally got that 120-minute case or 90-minute case study that night. And so I think that's a big part of it. Yeah, you're right. It's the Southampton, it's the Ajax. You know, you were able to look in the academy and say, yep, we do have someone in the pipeline who it's going to be a step down for at least 9 months, probably a year and a half. But then it's at least going to be a replacement, if not an upgrade. And frankly, that's worth it, especially when you consider how much money we can recoup in the process.
We need a whole league of Ajaxes, a whole league of Southamptons. Maybe we should make every team in MLS should wear red and white. That's what we need to do. It's
just an easy X. Exactly. Yeah. And you can choose whether that's solids or stripes. And that's it. That's your full choice.
And that's it. That's your home and away jersey, and people will just have to figure it out on the day.
Yeah, it'll be totally fine. Just the crest changes. That's it. Yeah, it's like Nike designing national team kits. Yeah.
There's probably a load of Chivas USA jerseys left over, right? We can just get in on that.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah.
Okay, so another thing I wanted to talk about was just to get your quick take on Minnesota's 2017 season. Obviously, it's over. Didn't make the playoffs. My understanding from a distance is that it started badly because of that whole let's buy players from Scandinavia idea. Then we switched maybe halfway through the season, strengthened the roster, and I would say finished pretty strong.
Yeah. If you take away that first month where they got 1 point in 4 games, I think they were only 0.1 points per game away from 6th place.
Right.
So, I mean, really, and then if you look at the goal differential as well, I think that was, 4, 9, 12. That negative 12 of their record-setting the goal differential wasn't record-setting, but of their awful 20-plus negative differential, 12 that came from those 3 losses. So, yeah, it was bad. Credit, honestly, to Adrian Heath for being willing to bench the most expensive player on the team, Vadim Demidov, for this NASL guy who didn't even start regularly until 2016 and was a local kid, Brent Coleman, who stepped in and, along with Jerome Tieson, were the 2 most consistent defenders on the team.
My understanding is that Demidov is a perfectly nice guy who kind of admits that it just didn't go well. And didn't. Yeah. It's not like he turned up and was lazy. It just was a bad fit, and he'll become like a warning story that parents will tell their kids about expansion teams. But it really wasn't his fault. It was just a bad fit, is my understanding of the situation.
Yeah, and I think that part of that is just the player's skills. I think he was able to thrive in Norway, and he was especially in Norway because that league is a slower, more possession-based league rather than teams with different styles now, which the league finally is in the last 3 years or so. Every team has its own kind of blueprint. So it was just the wrong fit for him. He wasn't quick enough. Joseph Martinez made that abundantly clear, and Fernando Adi made it pretty clear as well. So he wasn't quick enough for it. He wasn't necessarily strong enough in kind of the Aguchi Onyewu sense of being strong, where any player who runs into you is going to fall on their back. And his positioning, just for whatever reason, wasn't able to make up for it. So I think it was just the wrong player in the wrong year. I think he could have been a really good defender 2-3 years ago, honestly, in the league. If you look at some of those Columbus Crew backline pairings that they would have for Michael Parkhurst, I think he could have fit in just fine in some of those. But the league passed him by. But a player like Coleman, more athletic, younger, grittier, hungrier, that player is always going to be better than the 30-year-old making the most money he ever has in his career.
So what about the what about 2018? Are there sort of plans to I'm assuming making the playoffs will be sort of the goal, as it is for most teams, but especially for Minnesota next season. Has anything been revealed about exactly how they plan to go about that?
Well, they told the media on their media day on Wednesday that they are planning on getting, 5 to 8 pieces over this next, over this next transfer window. 5 to 8 pieces, which, if you're looking at a team, that's a fair amount of turnover, but that's also not like we're punting on this entire roster and we're going to try again fresh in a second expansion. So there are a lot of core pieces that are there. I would say that they've got 5 or 6 that you look at and it's like, they'll start again next year. But then you go from there. From what I've gathered, they're looking at fullback. I think that they do want a little more stability. Mark Birch wasn't able to get a ton of minutes towards the end of the year. He's going to be 34 next season, and that's pretty old for a left back. So he'll be more of a mentor role / kind of a spot starter, I would guess.
But that's fine. MLS teams need those players, though, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, if you look at Atlanta, they got more out of Lorenowitz than I think anyone expected this year. But he was also
I was heartbroken when he hit the post.
I was too.
Yeah, for him. He seems like such a good, solid guy.
Mm-hmm. Even for the biggest, kind of Atlanta haters, for the same reason that people sometimes hate Seattle and Portland, I suppose, because it's the new, cool, trendy team. Right. And so you want to be an antagonist towards them. I think even those people had to be disheartened to see Jeff Lorenowitz hit the post on that. In a very bizarre shootout, by the way. But for Minnesota, I think it's good to have Birch on your team for next year for that same reason. Cronin, exactly. He's going to be moving into, I think, age 30, 31. So he's going to fit more of that role. So you're looking at fullback, you're looking at midfield, you're looking for a couple of other upgrades across the pitch. But I do think that the core is there. Again, they were pretty close to a postseason team if you remove the first month where only 2 of the final week's 11 players were starting early in the season.
It's a bit of a makeover throughout the season. I wanted to ask you, does Minnesota United have a development academy?
They just started one. Yeah.
Okay.
So they're doing the 13-14, so you won't see a homegrown player sign for another year or two. But they did start it. Tim Carter is the main mind behind it. He did the Shattuck St. Mary Academy in the area, which produced Teal Bunbury. Right. So he has a track record. Their general manager of the academy used to work for the Crew in a very similar role. So he understands what's going on as far as, and his name is escaping me for some reason right now.
And I also know that there is Minnesota talent, right? There's like Jackson Ewell, I believe, is from the area. And,
correct.
McQuelly Akele is from the area.
Yes.
So there's
and his younger brother is even better than McQuelly. Yeah.
Is that right? Okay. So any chance he gets maybe into the development academy?
They're hoping. Yeah, I mean, my favorite play, I've watched, I think, 30 minutes of their practices so far this year, but there's a player whose first name is Chex, Chex.
Yeah.
And he is my new favorite player in the world of soccer because his name is Chex. So that's kind of what we're working with. I don't think McQuelly's brother isn't in the academy yet. Maybe could be. But there is Minnesota talent. I think that you've seen that over the years. Minnesota can produce it. Minnesota also does have a good portion of Wisconsin to work with as well,
right.
Which is kind of in a similar level of, there are good players, but we haven't seen like a world beater yet. And so I think that basically they're just waiting to find their equivalent of Hershey, Pennsylvania, and I think they'll be just fine.
Well, I think we all hope that happens, right? Because the more players that come from a similar situation, the better.
Yes.
All right, final thing I want to talk about is you made a bit of news on Twitter about a month ago when you tweeted out that Nashville. I wrote it down precisely. Nashville has been selected as an MLS expansion city, likely entering the league in 2019. And then I think you later said that sources are confident there's no final decision until December. But I think this tweet kind of went like wildfire around the internet because it came out as kind of like an announcement, right? So people weren't ready for this, I don't think.
No, and I do think, I mean, first off, if there's one thing I could have done, I would have actually said sources saying to make it less of an announcement. Yeah. That was the only thing that I would have changed about that because I stand by my report. Right. 2019 won't happen. It'll be 2020, 2021. And there is now a chance that the league, just to spite me, this totally won't happen. But watch, there'll be 27, 28 now, and I'll have to live with this for another year.
And that'll be called the Nashville Rooters.
Yes, exactly. I actually ended up inventing a cocktail that night that I named the Nashville 180, which is now my favorite cocktail. Which is, in case you're curious, it's a little bit of rye whiskey. It's some sour cherry bitters, or sour cherry liqueur, which is made by Tattersall, a local company. You've got some Angostura bitters, some simple syrup, pour it over ice, and put a couple of dark cocktail cherries in it. It's fantastic. Make yourself a Nashville 180. So, I mean, it was an absolutely insane 48 hours for me, especially right after that. I don't reveal sources ever, but there's still no reason for me to believe that Nashville won't be joining Major League Soccer. Based off of everything that I've heard, the league was understandably pretty upset to have some of this information get out. Dwayne Rollins, who's up in Canada, he was the one who had reported that Vancouver and Portland would be the expansion teams in 2011 before those were announced. And we were comparing notes, and he said this on his show as well, that he had a very similar backlash from the league as I've experienced. So, so you can also compare that and say, okay, well then things are fine. The league also never denied it. So, all of that happened. The league, for political reasons, can't say whether any of these teams, because there's been rumors that Sacramento, Cincinnati will be in the league for as long as people have known the league is expanding. But they can't let it seem like they've already decided before that Board of Governors voting. That said, the Board of Governors voting is, for all intents and purposes, a formality. They know very well what's viable and what's not before they vote.
So I'm fuzzy on the timeline of expansion. If Nashville is definitely one of the next expansion teams, does that mean that Sacramento and Cincinnati, one of them has to miss out?
Yeah, for this next round, yes.
Yes, okay.
Yeah, so it's really just choose two of those three. The stadium situation, the clearest stadium situation right now is Nashville, and Sacramento is pretty much at that level as well. It came out this week that Cincinnati would be able to play at Nippert Stadium, which is where they've been for their USL run for the last 2 years now.
Yeah.
And so that's semi-viable, but again, that's kind of it's a better version of the Yankee Stadium scenario where it's great, but then where are you actually going to be playing in the future? So, and the league has made it abundantly clear that they don't want more temporary stadiums or more non-soccer specific stadiums. So it's a dangerous standard to set if you say Cincinnati can also have that gap year. So it will be very interesting to see which two of those three get selected, but I'm still very confident Nashville will be one of those two.
So the thing that interests me, I understand you've probably got to be careful what you say, but the thing that interests me is if it sort of basically has been decided that Nashville are an expansion city, expansion team, and it hasn't been voted on, so there's no like official paperwork, but basically everybody
Correct.
knows that Nashville will be an expansion team.
Yep.
What's the benefit to the league of keeping that secret?
Right now, there are 12 ownership groups that are playing musical chairs. They think that there are still 4 open chairs, and if you're playing the music and suddenly they turn and see the Nashville ownership sitting in one of the chairs while the other 11 are dancing around 3, they're going to get off. It's sort of an idea of preferential treatment. The league, it's not a cheap game either, right? This is a $150 million game for the first round, and it's going to be even more for the next.
Yeah.
So,
and presumably, even before you spend the $150 million, you're spending you're spending good money on your attempt to get an expansion franchise.
Absolutely, yeah. You're spending good money on that. You're having, I mean, some of these teams. If you're looking at Nashville, they had to start a USL team from scratch. Mm-hmm. Phoenix Rising had to go through a rebrand from Arizona. They are spending money, and if you look at again, based out of Minnesota, I've seen Minnesota United has had to maybe pinch pennies a little bit more on player acquisitions because they're also building their soccer-specific stadium. And that Allianz Field is going to be beautiful, but that's quite an undertaking, financially. And then they have the $100 million expansion fee that they paid in installments, and then you have all of this other stuff where it's not cheap. It's not just the expansion fee that is going into this. And so there's so much money going, not just from the ownership groups, but from the cities and the markets themselves, in the case of the Triangle, that they are trying to build up the infrastructure. Detroit is suddenly putting on hold other uses for that jail site and saying, yeah, okay, we'll build a super complex if we get this team. And so that's stalling the city's development. Mm-hmm. And so there's so many factors that go into this that I do understand from a business side why the league is wanting to wait as long as they possibly can to announce these so as to keep this all going in all 12 of these markets to the extent that it's going right now. Obviously, there are some that are to a lesser extent. San Antonio is understandably furious about this Austin talk. Yeah. St. Louis is pretty disheartened after that stadium vote. San Diego, similarly. Some of the groups, Indies remained very quiet despite being there. But for some of these heavier hitters, and even like a Tampa Bay, for example, who very much seems like they could be a viable candidate geographically, if nothing else, because I think that the league, I talked about this with Jason Davis a few weeks ago, but the league right now looks at the Southeast and they say, we can make that Cascadia 2.0. Mm-hmm. Look what's happened with those 3. Let's say we get Atlanta, Orlando, Nashville, and maybe Tampa in that case. That's a fantastic assortment. And then Miami as well. Mm-hmm. Even if you don't get Tampa, you get Miami.
Some good Florida rivalries going on there.
Yeah, and we saw how well it worked to have 2 teams in Florida last time in MLS. But I think that's the biggest case of it here is there's so much money on the line that they want to try to keep it on their terms of breaking the news to these other 10 owners that they've got to wait for the last 2 slots.
So I have kind of an interesting idea that just came to me.
Sure.
There is obviously so much interest in expansion franchises and only so many spots that Major League Soccer are making available. If we are sort of in the process of, 2018 World Cup failure, we need to rethink some things. If all these markets say they're ready to go with MLS teams, maybe this is the moment to sort of loosen the leash a little bit and maybe really try and get those teams up and running as Major League Soccer franchises and expand quickly, but maybe do like an MLS 2 type thing and step towards Pro Rel and invent a second division of Major League Soccer. Say you can have a franchise for less than the 150 million or whatever it is right now. You give them a discounted franchise, but then also offer them the guarantee that within a few years there'll be a chance to get promoted through on-field performance into Major League Soccer 1. And then you can really untap all that potential and all that interest from business owners.
Mm-hmm. That piercing horn that you're all hearing right now is the sound of Twitter cowering at the mention of ProRel on a podcast.
We've been saying it more and more lately. We're not scared of anyone. All
right. Well, I'm dragged into this now as having the worst specific prediction. I suppose I am in this now as well. That is something that I've heard from people within the league as well, as being a dream, a goal of theirs. That said, if you're looking at it on paper, I'll stick to Minnesota, right? Mm-hmm. Because Minnesota entered the league in 2017, probably a year sooner than they wanted to, frankly. I think that deep down they were hoping they could have joined in 2018, just to have more in place and more time.
Because they had to finish playing that NASL season, right? So they had less time than, say, Atlanta. Yeah, okay, I get it.
Yeah. So maybe the gap year would have helped. Okay, so Minnesota has paid the $100 million. They're building their stadium, which is also, 9 figures. And then they also are buying these players, and some of them aren't working out, like Demidov and some of these Scandinavian guys who came in on loan, but they're putting this money in, right? And so suddenly the ownership group led by Dr. Bill McGuire is sat down and says, look, thank you for your investment. You've been a worthy participant in the first division. Just so you know, if you do not finish in the playoff zone, there is a shot that you will be in the second division league. Mm-hmm. I think that's a tough sell. Likewise, if you're telling, let's say, the Triangle in Carolina that they're buying into MLS 2, they're not going to want to pay $150 million or whatever the rate is at that point, because they're like, well, we're in the second tier. We're coming from the NASL, which is also, for this year still, the second tier. Why are we making this jump, and why are we paying as if we're moving to the top flight? And so then is the league going to have to cut corners and say, okay, well, we'll let you pay $100 million? Sure, but then let's say that these are a lot of hypotheticals, but this whole situation is Cincinnati paid $150 million to get in, and now they're getting relegated for a team that paid $100. That ownership group is not happy either. And I think that it's just for the financial reasons, for the way that the league was set up, it's going to be so difficult to get promotion relegation for that reason alone, and we're not even getting into travel costs in case you get this Bournemouth-esque move for a team like Chattanooga, who suddenly is able to make it to the top flight. We'll see what the travel budget would be like. But for these ownership groups, that the expansion fee keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and there's already enough kind of secret tension about Beckham's buy being so cheap. Mm-hmm. How are you going to be able to level the playing field where someone like Dr. McGuire is okay with the chance that cheaper teams that came into the league after his team for cheaper are suddenly taking his place in the top flight that he paid to get into? I think that that's going to be the biggest hurdle to climb.
Without getting too deep into the weeds, I was imagining a situation where the teams expanding into the newly created MLS 2 would pay a much, much smaller expansion fee, but also there would be no promotion to big Major League Soccer. Yeah.
Big MLS. I like that, yeah.
For like maybe 5 years, 10 years or something like that. So you put like a long timeline on it so you protect the recent expansion teams. And then maybe it is time to sort of cap the expansion fee. And because it's almost like one of the worries I have about MLS is I worry that the expansion fees are kind of the money they're relying on to keep the whole thing going. And so maybe they need to stop upping that number.
So first off, would Major League Soccer's website then be majorleaguesoccer.com? Because that is a beautiful, beautiful website, and I think I'm going to get that domain right now. And I think I see that. I think that the cap makes a lot of sense. From what I seem to understand, the expansion fee is also kind of the market valuation of the average MLS franchise, or like the low end average. It's not quite like you're assuming you're going to become Toronto now, finally, or become Seattle, Atlanta, New York City. But it's also not saying we're going to let you pay what some of these lower valuated clubs, like we've all learned over the last couple of weeks, Columbus now is. Right. You're not paying that level. So I think it's some sort of happy medium between the high end and the low end. So then it's tough. Again, it's the expansion fee. That's honestly the biggest hurdle right now. Because, again, teams that have paid the expansion fee don't want to feel like they lost money on that fee alone, and teams that pay the cheaper one are pretty much getting a bargain even if they stay in the second division.
How about my other idea is, because really it's not just that I want to make ProRel happen in that MLS 1, MLS 2 kind of way. It's not just that. Sure. It's more that there's so many like owners ready to go and start up teams I feel like that would be good for soccer in America. So how about the idea of just MLS just opens the floodgates and say, okay, so many people are interested, we're going to just have 10 expansion spots. Let's just go for it. Let's open it up and see what happens.
I've actually heard whispers that they're not going to stop at 28.
Right, yeah, just keep on going.
Yeah, I mean,
I don't know if it's a good idea or not, but I think if there's an owner willing to put money into a city, into a team, and it's going to have a development academy attached to it, I see that being a benefit to the US men's national team in the long term, because presumably players come through those development academies. Presumably you catch more talent because you've got sort of like better coaching standard in specific areas. Like right now, Detroit City FC is the biggest team in Detroit, right? And they don't have a development academy.
Right, exactly. And Detroit isn't a small market by any means, and so you have to imagine that there are quality players over there. If you look at the map of where homegrown claims can come from, there are a lot of gaps.
I'm assuming Chicago probably gets Detroit, right? It just goes across the water and encapsulates that,
Right, and then you look at Kansas City's, and it's like Kansas City is now trying to scout Montana. Like, they're not going to put the same sort of focus on Montana as they're putting in their own market, within driving range. And why should they? So, I completely agree with you in the sense that more teams is absolutely better. Maybe the answer for that is that the USL becomes more stable and has a better foundation to be able to build upon that, so that Hertha Helena is actually a viable club for when Hertha Berlin ultimately decides to go into the USL, which is a scenario that we all know is coming. Or you get Celtic Boise.
Wait, is that true? I didn't know.
No, not at all. Not at all.
I thought some big news had passed me by.
But when you're looking at, when Rayo Vallecano came to Oklahoma City, they saw that as a chance.
That didn't work out though, right?
Not at all. And FC Barcelona wants to get a team in the NWSL apparently. So I think you get to some of these markets would eventually be populated by these, like they look at what Citigroup has been able to do in New York City and say, why can't we do that? And so maybe they say, okay, the cheaper way to test the waters and see how it goes is we start with the USL. If that works, either the system's open by then and we get in, or this is the longest, by the way, I've ever let myself talk about pro rel. So I'm feeling a little bad right now. And
you're welcome.
Thank you. I need this, apparently. Or the alternative is you pay the expansion fee if there's still expansion slots open, but at least it gives the cheaper scenario for them to see if this works. Rayo Vallecano not only did not work in Oklahoma City whatsoever, but they got relegated that year. And they, I think, got relegated again, if I remember right, to the Spanish third division, or they were within the relegation zone certainly last year. So whether those two are related because there was even 10% of the focus shifted away from Vallecano, or if that's just a coincidence, remains to be determined. But it's not a great case study to show that every group can emulate what Manchester City's new owners were able to do with New York City.
Maybe an interesting test case is the Barcelona Development Academy. That is, I've forgotten exactly where it is. It's in Real Salt Lake are in Utah. So this academy is in Arizona, I believe, where the RSL Academy used to be.
Yeah.
So I wonder if anything, like if a professional team somehow weirdly grows on top of that academy to enter USL or whatever, that could be interesting.
And honestly, I can see where even if the first American player to play for Barcelona or be signed to a contract by Barcelona came from the academy, that would send massive shockwaves through the entire country, right?
To Barcelona, Arizona, they'd be called.
Barcelona, Arizona, exactly. Yeah, but I think you're absolutely right. Like that would be possibly the best case scenario for a lot of these questions that we've been talking about for a while today. The best case scenario would be it's a young American player who either spends a couple years on loan with RSL and then goes to Barcelona, or is able to go right from the academy in Arizona to Barcelona, because that would show a lot more viability for the development structure, which hasn't been great over the last 10 years. And I think that's another reason why this cycle was so difficult, to put it mildly, for the U.S. men's national team. But it's also helping show the viability of the American player abroad, because I think that that's going to be a huge question over the next 4 years. Yes, Pulisic has broken through. Weston McKennie continues to. But a player like, Tyler Adams, would he have a tougher time getting a contract at a top-flight Big Five league because the American structure wasn't able to get to a World Cup with the first draft of him, Kellen Acosta, on the roster? I don't know. Or will it be tougher for Kellen Acosta to get that exit because he's 22, 23, it's about that time where he's probably thinking that.
He's been talking about it, right? Didn't he talk about it after the Gold Cup? So I think he's a really good test case this January for how difficult is it for an established-ish US men's national team player who's one of the big names on his MLS team, who's a homegrown player who wants to move to Europe, assuming some teams come in for him, which I think they will. Yeah. How complicated is it for him to leave in terms of, the club accepting the fee and him being happy with where he goes?
And so then that would be a case of how other leagues see the American player as viable if they haven't had that experience already. No pressure, Kellen. Yeah, I think you're right. Yeah, I think that you're absolutely right. It's going to be huge. And I think Kellen Acosta is probably the biggest example. I don't think Christian Roldan will get those offers quite yet. I think they want to see another year, even though he's had a best 11 caliber season this year with Seattle. But I think you're absolutely right. I think that is going to be, that's going to begin the narrative of the next 5 years, where we're seeing whether or not these American players are still having a chance to play abroad.
All right, we've run a little long, so I want to bring it back full circle to the last part of the conversation. I assume that you are waiting for the official Nashville announcement. So do you have a tweet in draft that's like, see, I was right. Told you so. Told you.
I have a screenshot from the moment I had to delete it, where after 40 minutes, it was over 1,000 retweets, and I had to pull it for political reasons that ended up backfiring anyway. But yes, I have that screenshot. I think I've had about 10 drafts of that tweet in my mind that I've cycled through. It's got to be short and succinct, right? Like I can't get to 280 characters or whatever and use all 280. No one's going to have time for that.
Do you have 280? Are you on the list?
No, I have 140.
Yeah,
I have 140. But I just watched the Nugs kid. Give me those Wendy's Nugs. He probably has 280. So that's a great use of that new technology. But I think it's got to be short and sweet. I don't know if it's just going to be a shruggy or something, but I'm very much looking forward to that day, just so that this whole chapter can close.
One thing that interests me, if you don't mind talking about this for another second, is you mentioned earlier that if you just added sources say, that it wouldn't have had such a big impact. And what really interests me about this is that it was just a tweet. It wasn't a story that you published. Do you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. It wasn't like you pitched it to The Guardian and said, hey, this is definitely happening. I'm going to write this. We're going to publish it. We're going to make it, a big headline. Mm-hmm. I sort of find that really interesting, the way Twitter has changed over the last few years from being a place where you could kind of say stuff, but it wasn't almost like it wasn't public record. But now it's become a place where you actually announce things. I think it's a big. I'm not sure there's even a question here. It's just, I guess, do you agree that that's sort of the media landscape has changed so that Twitter becomes the place for announcements?
Well, it's the quickest way to get news, right?
Right. Oh, so the New York Times will tweet a story out maybe before they publish it.
Maybe, yeah. Or I do know that, like, when the Cronin Birch story broke, the St. Paul Pioneer Press, Andy Greder's their writer, and he put out just a placeholder headline article and tweeted out this trade was happening right after it was broken by me. And he put this out, and then he wrote the story later, but his headline was out so it could start circulating, because that's the easiest way to get buzz.
Yeah.
There's two cases. So I had gotten word that other people were working on the Nashville break. So that's part of the reason that I resort to Twitter. I was talking to an editor. There were other reasons that we couldn't put this on one of the publications I write for with increased regularity. And then you get to whether or not people want to read it, right? There's the pivot to video, but I think there's also been the pivot to 140 characters. You want this as quickly as possible. So in May, when I broke that Francesco Totti was offered a contract by Miami FC of the NASL, that circulated, but it had an article. And if I look at it, there were way more impressions on the tweet than there were clicks on the article. Because what are you going to get beyond the headline of a story like Nashville to MLS, Totti to NASL? You're not going to get a lot, frankly. You're going to get background on the player, just using the Totti example.
Yeah.
You're going to get background on the player. You're going to get why this would make sense. And maybe you'll get some figures if those were known by whoever's reporting it. And if you don't have all of that information, a tweet does the job, and it saves you a lot of time. And for someone who freelances, time is valuable in the sense that then I can work on other pieces. Or there's the alternative that you would have to hit a word count in order to get that check. And what if you don't have enough? You feel bad just giving them kind of AP copy, which is Nashville is a city of X people, which is known for their music. Like you don't want that either.
Is Nashville a standalone city?
In the sense of
AP style.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, all right. I'll double check that afterwards.
Yeah, we should. Yeah, I don't know that either.
I was just thinking if it wasn't, then you get another word in with Tennessee.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, and then I can use the TN, and I think they would count that down the road. So, but yeah, I do think that it's a strange landscape right now. It's made it easier for people like myself to be able to kind of crack into the game of it, because I don't need to be a regular writer for the New York Times, right? And so that's one thing. That blue check mark is so stupid, but it also does help add a level of viability to it, and it's something that a lot of reporters will need to look for. But at the same point, it also is a very dangerous thing, because let's say I go on a bender over the Halloween weekend, I better not be tweeting anything.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah. Twitter should invent a thing where you can just lock yourself out of Twitter for a set amount of time.
It should have like a parental control and a TV guide, back when the TV guides were a thing, where like I can go through the motions of tweeting, and they'll say tweet, and then it's just going to like text it to my brother or something, and I'll at least feel like I'm tweeting, and then no one else sees it. I think that would be the best integration for Twitter I can possibly imagine, and I personally would love that.
All right, I think we've got a new startup we can get going after this podcast. All right, Jeff, I think I should say goodbye at this point, just in case we run a little too long, but I've really enjoyed chatting with you. It's been good.
Yeah, happy to help anytime, and really do keep up the good work. I know it's been a bit of a gut punch over the month of October as far as your main kind of bread and butter coverage, but you two do phenomenal work, and for someone who has co-hosted a couple of podcasts before, I think that having the kind of bedrock podcasts in American soccer has been crucial for allowing more fans and more writers, readers to be able to get into the game. So truly thank you for everything that you're doing on your side as well.
Oh, wow, thanks. That's really touching. Thank you, Jeff. Appreciate it. So one thing I'll do to return the favor, I will spell your name correctly in the show notes, which is something I failed to do when you appeared in January. I will get it this time.
I appreciate that.
And if people want to read your work, where can they find you? Do you want to list specific outlets, or would you rather just people go through your Twitter and follow from there?
Well, Twitter's the easiest way to go about finding it. You can find me at Jeff Rueter, Rueter, Daryl. And then otherwise, the main ones at this point, I suppose, you'll see work coming out from me from ESPN, The Guardian, 442, and then Howler magazine and Howler's website.
All right, that's not a bad collection of outlets. All right, Jeff, thank you for taking the time to talk to me today.
Yeah, not a problem. Enjoy the weekend.